along with the changing scape of talent pipelines, that folks are much more inclined to choose where they want to live first before where they want to work. And so people are becoming the #1 driving factor of these attraction projects. And so we need to build a community or a system in place that allows us to attract that talent before we can get that company that we'd like to attract. And so in turn, quality of place becomes that much more important as a result of this changing dynamic in economic development. So what's driving this influence behind this evolution in economic development? We start again with people in this case. Again, really focusing first on where we want to live before where we want to work comes up as a question. And those components and those elements that build a strong community foundation that allows us to attract the kind of talent we want, access to housing and childcare and community culture are much more important and vital. And again, as we talk about this, we'll see the parallels as we begin to unpack that Amazon HQ2 RFI process. And then second, influencing it is really place, right? The accessibility of it. How accessible is it in terms of being able to integrate into the community, being able to create friendships and relationships and strong community ties that all make up the culture and the engaging component of that community. And finally, what are those unique elements that your community has that no place else can or has the ability to offer? And finally, politics. And this isn't necessarily specific to partisan. In fact, it's much more nuanced than that. It's really looking at the advent of social media and how that has really changed the dynamic of conversation. One person with a platform through Twitter or through Instagram or through Facebook can reach thousands of individuals and in turn reach tens of thousands more in their circle of influence, and how that creates a shift in transparency and equitable conversations. Next, generational changes. The nature of our workforce is changing as the Great Tsunami sweeps across the country, really, and changes the nature of what our workforce really looks like fundamentally, and how does that change the way that we manage and grow individuals within our employers. And finally, social awareness in companies. Just as the workforce is changing and looks different, employers are changing the dynamics of how they engage with social values to adhere and to align themselves with the types of employees that they want to attract. We see this first trend in people really changing. Again, I talked about the generational changes in the workforce. This is certainly probably no more salient than this here. 75% of the global workforce will be millennials by 2025. This is impactful and important to note because it really is distincted from how we see workforces now or in the past 2 decades. Millennials have a different way of viewing the world. And in fact, they have a different way of viewing their own particular companies that they work for. 55% of millennials that say their organizations are more flexible and tend to stay longer than 5 years, as opposed to those that say their company is inflexible, only plan to stay 17% long term. When we look at diversity and inclusion, those things that kind of make up the culture of a community or culture of a company, really, 69% of those millennials that identify their organization as diverse or inclusive plan to stay at least 5 years, versus only about a quarter that identify their company is not inclusive or diverse. And so what do we find here? We know that diversity and inclusion then have staying power. They have the ability to retain the kind of workforce that we want to have. And we can expand this into our own communities. Do we think that our community is inclusive and diverse? And what does that mean for our ability to attract and retain the kind of talent we want locally? And when we start to look at place and some of those dynamics that are shifting and changing the focus that make up where our traditional views on that are, we start out by looking at baby boomers and millennials. 44% are likely to move in the next 5 years. About 10,000 baby boomers retire every day. That's a significant number of people that are leaving the workforce with a unique set of skills and talents and disposable income. And those are all opportunities for you as a community to think about how can we begin to attract that kind of talent, both from a millennial perspective, so the folks that have the capacity and the motivation and the time to work, and those that have the skill set and the unique experiences that you would like to tap into and that disposable income. And even more, how these individuals view community and what their traditional sense and definition of it is also changing. 86% said it was important for their city to offer opportunities to live and work without relying on a car. a significant way of looking at how our community is set up, the kind of resources and infrastructure investments that we make. And finally, 66% believe that investing in schools and community features such as transportation and walkable areas is a better way to grow the economy than maybe traditional business development. So again, the way that we look at how community fits into overall economic development is certainly changing and becoming that much more salient. And we can see this happening in a number of ways. First two examples are corporate headquarters being changed to fit the needs of the kind of community that they require based on the talent needs that they have. So rather than waiting for the existing communities that these companies were located in, create talent strategies around building their talent pipeline, they picked up and they moved. They moved their headquarters to where they thought they could be most competitive to attract the kind of talent they wanted. McDonald's moving their global headquarters to downtown Chicago, and 2 years ago, before GE had the trouble that it's having now, announced that they were moving their corporate headquarters from Connecticut to Boston in search of the talent that they need. And increasingly, this is impacting economic development organizations by way of the incentives that we offer and the strategies that we use to attract and retain the kind of talent that we want. Some states in the Northeast, Vermont, is offering a $10,000 stipend to those individuals that want to move there but work remotely. So trying to build out that talent base, but not necessarily providing economic opportunities for them there, realizing that where you want to live is a much more important factor than necessarily where you want to work. So some of those values that are driving how employers think and respond can certainly be seen here. This is out of the 2018 Deloitte Millennial Study, looking at the kind of values that millennials have relative to the values they think their companies have. And so when I talked about the political nature of the influencing changes in economic development, thinking about how companies engage in social values and social discussion is changing, we can see that this trend is being really driven by that workforce and that 75% that's coming online. On the left-hand side, you see those views and priorities that millennials and Gen Zers tend to have, and they think that their companies should align themselves to have. And on the right are the more traditional components that we think about when we think of corporations generating profit, increasing efficiency, and providing and selling the services or goods that they traditionally do. But from this perspective and this new potential workforce, it's really about marrying the two together, right? We want you to still be efficient. We want you still to have profits, but we want you to take those gains that you've made and reinvest them back in the communities that you live in and that we work in. So creating sustainability around goals, improving society, these are values that as millennials begin to more enter the workforce, they expect their companies to have. And so this is changing the way that companies make decisions and where they locate. And we can expand this even further and say, looking at that diversity and inclusion component about retention and growth within a company, what do they actually mean by that, and how do we create that both within our community and even in our workforces? It's not anymore about that box that we check with a compliance component that diversity tends to the conversations around diversity tend to swirl around. But it's looking at diversity in terms of thought, how we think, more openness and transparency in decision-making, creating an opportunity to add value and impact in the companies and communities that we work in. And really taking the fundamental nature and definition of diversity and using it much more as a tool for performance and better business outcomes than simply, again, that afterthought of that box that we check. So these influences of people, place, and politics are really shaping economic development, but more rapidly are shaping the way that our companies look at the world and how they make decisions on where they should locate and where they should expand. And we can see that in the Amazon HQ2 project itself, and we'll see that as we go through the remainder of this presentation today. So these company values then, as companies look at how they set their priorities, we as economic development organizations also need to look at how we engage with our companies, how we engage with our communities, and how can we align ourselves to better equip our local employers to be more competitive in this field so that they can, again, recruit and attract the kind of talent that will be entering the workforce in the near future. So economic development is started as this one-leg stool of business development, really focusing on growing our existing businesses and retaining them, recruiting new businesses, and helping our small businesses set up and organically grow. And while that is still certainly a cornerstone in the new reimagined economic development, we see this expansion of a more holistic approach that includes people and putting talent as a priority in how we look at economic development and how we look at strategic planning, and placemaking as well, that as we know that people become much more crucial and talent becomes much more crucial in the way that we do economic development, it's important for us to focus on place as well and building those elements and those intangibles, the community culture, to be much more intentional about how we design and develop that. So when we look at how economic development overall has been reimagined, we need to begin to think about a framework that's much more broad. Again, that includes those people components and those placemaking components. And that as we begin to design those intentional strategies around what we're doing and how do we create intentional readiness, what does that look like, creating a much broader audience to use as our sounding board, to use as our qualitative input into those processes, and have that mindset that we need to shape the future, not just adapt to it, right? To change the curve that we're headed down. So jumping into HQ2 and looking at the RFI, there were a number of instructions that were provided to communities that were looking to respond. And in the process of this project, we analyzed 56 public RFI responses. So there were a number that were privately concealed, and so we didn't have access to those. But most of the publicly available RFI responses were included in our analysis. But when you get an RFI generally, this is pretty standard, but in this particular case, they were looking at considering only those metro areas in North America. And they encouraged states, provinces, and metro areas to coordinate with their regional partners along with the submission of the RFP. So rather than getting 3 or 4 RFPs from one particular geographic area, get one that shows that there's a level of alignment. And then some more logistical items that were, relatively small, but certainly still important, of how you should submit the RFP itself, and some more housekeeping items. But an essential piece of the RFI process, especially as they look to utilize and leverage that data as they go into the decision-making process, all of these components are really important and intentionally designed to create more efficiencies in their process. Really quickly, an overview of the HQ2 project, because this has been going on for almost a little over a year actually now. Total jobs, 50,000 with an average salary of about 100,000, with a hiring span or project completion span of over 10 to 15 years. The capital expenditure, $5 billion. And then when we look more specifically at some of their specific needs that they've identified, the checklist of what meets their specific threshold, a metropolitan area with 1 million people in it, a stable and friendly business environment, and you can think of that as both subjective and objective in some of those components that go into making that. The potential to attract and retain a strong talent pipeline, really important. And then a community that has the ability to think creatively about some of the real estate needs and how can you stack a project that can meet the needs of this particular project. Then some more blue sky thinking, ideally be it urban or downtown campus area, similar to the kind of layout that they have in Seattle, with a development-ready site, something that they can hit the ground running with and don't have to do much for it. Then the specific location requirements, proximity to population, proximity to transportation assets are really important. Mass transit accessibility, an important aspect for their talent component of it. And then size requirements, split up into different phases. So all of these things are considerations that went into the project and how different states and EDOs responded to the project itself in the RFI. Full landscape, 238 proposals from across North America that included parts of Canada and Mexico along with the U.S. This was narrowed down to 20 different communities across the U.S., really ranging in size and location, but certainly a cluster in the Northeast and in Mid-Atlantic region. So before we begin to sort of unpack that analysis and what we look at it, we want to think about some of those drivers that went into this. And when we think about the RFI itself and the number of communities that responded to it, the 238, some of those underlying motivations behind applying for it certainly can be brought into question, but they really can be summarized into three key categories here. And that's first is political, right? It was politically driven. It would have been unpopular not to respond to it. Investors or stakeholders in our economic development organizations expected us to put together a response, even if we didn't meet the particular standard. And you can think that this likely is the case for some of the RFIs that you even respond to that aren't at the level of awareness or heightened scrutiny that Amazon HQ2 provided. Back in this time around last year, we wrote an article about using the Amazon RFQ or RFI process as a way to build capacity in your existing RFI process. And what we mean by that is just really using it as a practice opportunity. And there were a number of communities that likely went through this process, use it to build up capacity, aggregate and consolidate the information that typically goes into RFIs, and submit it to see kind of where they would go with that. And then, of course, there were the practical submissions, right? The ones that met all of the tick marks or most of the tick marks and made that response because they felt that they had a competitive opportunity on the other end of this process. The other outcome of this project really is this idea of increasing competitiveness. We know that economic development increasingly is becoming more competitive. There are over 3,000 communities across the counties across the U.S., and when you stop to think about within your own county how many economic development organizations or programs or apparatuses exist in those areas, and just expand that across those 3,000, and it becomes much more apparent that how you separate yourself among that noise is differentiation. And we can see that within the varying levels of responses in the RFI about just how similar one area might seem to the other, so it's that much more important to showcase how different you really are from your neighbor. And what we begin to see is that these mega projects, what I would call unicorns, while they are becoming more frequent, aren't the end-all be-all, and they're certainly going to those areas that have the capacity to absorb them. So for many of the economic developers around the country, it's really those 50 to 60 level employers that are coming along. And just think about the talent scarcity that is around the country. So how those are the kinds of projects that you can absorb into your own community. So as you start to think about that, and how many of those communities that are working towards those kinds of projects, it becomes that much more of a priority to focus on those points of differentiation, to differentiate yourself from those competitors. And then finally, readiness should be a standard. If nothing else, that's what Amazon HQ taught us, was that readiness is no longer something that we hope you have, but is something that you need to have to be a finalist, to be competitive in this economy, especially, again, with those companies that are looking to expand with 30 to 40 to 50 people. It's really important to show that you are ready to absorb that kind of growth almost immediately. Because there are dozens and dozens of other communities that certainly can show that. Some of the other outcomes that we think about when we went through this process were what this impact has on economic development and on site selection. And for economic development, it really cements the factor that talent is here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. Barring any weird anomaly in our environment, politically or otherwise, talent is certainly here to stick around for a while. So beginning to realize as an economic development organization that this is certainly becoming part of your periphery. 10 years ago, you might have thought that talent was really better left, or workforce was better left to the Department of Workforce, the workforce development boards in your communities, and other organizations. It's much more relevant now today than ever that economic developers need to prioritize this. And then beyond smokestacks, right, beyond this idea of just business attraction and community and economic development, what we traditionally think about it is, there are all of these other elements that are now falling into place. We need to think about storefronts, not just smokestacks anymore. We need to think about housing and quality of place, and how does that have a role in it? Because as talent continues to drive this process, we need to think about how we're going to build strategies to retain the folks we have, develop the ones that need developing, and then identify those audiences that resonate with our messaging and get them to fall in love with the places that we live. Finally, the other thing that I think Amazon HQ2 has done for economic development is create awareness around what we do and how we do it. And this is for better or worse. we can see that sort of in the midst of Amazon HQ2 conversation, Foxconn was wrapped up, and that landed in Wisconsin with an incredible historical incentive of nearly $4 billion. And when we think about Amazon and the incentives that are going to go into that, will likely come close to or exceed that of Foxconn. So when we begin to think about what that means for us as professionals and how this is going to refocus the community's attention on economic development, it brings into question kind of what is our role in growing the economy, is it effective, and all of these other things that come into play. Finally, site selection. There was a lot of discussion around what does this mean for the site selection industry? Is it really relevant anymore? If you've got a company like Amazon that can just take all of this data from 238 communities around the world and aggregate it, and now they've got all of these data sets and unique opportunity to use and leverage that information. A couple of weeks ago, I had a chance to talk with some of my colleagues in the site selection industry, and the general consensus was that, it probably doesn't change it all that much. And I would point to Apple HQ2. Shortly after Amazon launched its RFI process, they announced they were also looking at a new headquarters, but using a very traditional method of doing that, using site selectors, or whether that be internal or external firms. And then we look at, again, the size of the companies. When we think about Amazon itself, they have a massive economic development program within their company. They're a massive organization, multi-global and focused. Not every company is that, and not every company can have that. And so when we look at our own clients and we say industry to industry and market to market, varying on the size of the company, some might have some level of economic development individual that is focused on that in their company now going forward, but by and large, site selection is certainly here to stay. And when we look at pipelines across the country, on average, about 30% of attraction project pipelines at the state level tend to come from site selectors, and we don't see that number really changing all of that much. So when we look at all of that and we analyze it, we say, yeah, the biggest impact is aggregated data. If nothing else, the RFI process has helped other site selection firms because it has forced these economic development organizations to align themselves and align their data and create an organized and aggregated approach to the kind of information that they're supplying. So again, we looked at 56 different RFIs, all of which were publicly available, and we analyzed them and we said, what are these core components that really form the best practices, that are really doing well? And then we went back and we said, let's align those along the expectations and those key considerations that Amazon had as they were looking to go forward. And what those considerations are, those key drivers in their decision process, and again, in no particular order, really looked at sites and buildings, costs, which included incentives, labor force, logistics, speed to market, and those community and cultural fit options. So when we think about those key drivers that are why companies choose to relocate or expand, we can think about access to markets, access to talent or people, operating costs across the board, and some of those unique physical infrastructure pieces. And in this particular case, when we think about unique physical infrastructure, it would almost be unique intangible infrastructure, those community cultural fits with the key communities. Starting out with sites and buildings, and we start here intentionally because when we think about economic development, the baseline for readiness is around product, is around your ability to serve and meet the need of growth and expansion. This one is out of Columbia, Maryland, looking at their available sites and buildings and what they have to offer for this particular project. They did a nice job at parceling out those availabilities, showing that they're 100 acres and what land is developable, which is a key component for any site selection company to understand and for any economic developer to understand, which is simply because you have an industrial park that has 150 acres, not all 150 may be developable. So showcasing very specifically and clearly and simply what that is. They've showed the opportunity based on the location, if you look at the table, along the lines of the number of buildings in that area, the capacity for development, and the potential that they can bring that particular site online. So they're showing that they have a pipeline in the mix. They know that this is a phased project, and so they're thinking ahead about how we can drive greater readiness and clarity around the readiness that we have built. More of a marketing and branding approach to sites and buildings. This is out of Connecticut, looking at building a specific sites and buildings database if you don't already have one. but then branding it to match the company. Again, you're not going to do this with every organization, certainly, but in ones that those big unicorn projects, those elephants that you really want to go after, it's a value-added approach to create an interactive map for the RFP. And so the user in this particular case has the ability to search the sites and buildings along with those local amenities. So aligning what that particular site has available to it in its specific area in an interactive and engaging way that leverages data in a digital fashion. Capital and operating costs, along with the incentives. This, of course, is a critical component of any site selection project. What New York has done here is shown relative to those areas where they feel like they are most likely going to compete with. You'll notice that they included Seattle, showcasing kind of what they're familiar with. It's a great opportunity to showcase how you compete relative to their existing footprint. So if in the rare cases that you know the company or the organization, highlighting their existing footprint relative to yours, as long as it's competitive, is always good. Again, when you're going through this process, the expectation, right, is that you deploy the data in a competitive fashion. I think that's what all site selectors will likely think of. So feel free to manipulate the data in a way that will make you stand out relative to those other areas where you see are likely competitors. Because at the end of the day, those site selectors will certainly know whether or not you're competitive relative to the other areas in their mix. Highlighting those incentives in a way that makes sense, being sure to capture everything from state-level incentives on down to local incentives that are available are really important. And then using the assumptions that they provided. If you know the number of individuals and the salary, payroll impacts, especially if it's an as-of-right incentive, showcasing kind of what that is, and highlighting maybe how they might access those incentives in ones that are built into it. A good example of this is the Foxconn incentive, albeit it's $4.5 billion. A large component of those incentives are as-of-right. It's built into the tax code, so they get it regardless of whether or not they perform. So long as they are a manufacturer, they get those credits. So if you have those built into your existing tax code, be sure to leverage those as part of the numbers that you're showcasing here. Labor, again, we talked a lot about talent as being a driving force on it, showcasing the accessible talent pipeline that you already have, along with showcasing what the ecosystem is to build out that talent pipeline. In this particular case, the state of New Hampshire and their Rfi Response provided different value propositions for their education institutions and the ecosystem that builds out, and how does that resonate with the kinds of jobs that Amazon can expect to capture from those. Similarly, in New York, they created a very unique pitch around the types of talent that they thought would be critical to this particular institution or this particular project, specifically around technical talent. So showcasing that they have the ability to not only absorb the kind of growth because they have the excess talent, but also build on that talent pipeline, showing that they've already put the infrastructure in place to continually serve the needs of this particular project well after the 2019 initial build-out. When we think about logistics and access to markets and where we can get in and out, this is a great example out of Boston using unique graphical data, so marrying this idea of maps along with pleasing value-added data that really shows proximity to downtown areas. If you recall, one of those components was a population center, or being 30 minutes from a population center, showcasing kind of what that is, along with the proximity it is to other transportation assets to be able to get in and out of those areas. New Jersey did something similar again here, showcasing again the transportation assets that are available throughout their state, both on a local level in terms of mass transit along with major highways, and then also showcased the international travel that's available, which was again a requirement, 45 minutes to an international airport. Being able to get in and out of their secondary headquarters will be critical to creating the kind of ecosystem that Amazon wants to create throughout their footprint. Speed to market. one of the more critical components of it. And I think that this is a really great way to showcase it using the graphics that they did in the lower left here with the table showing kind of what expectations of timeline that they have, how long it would take for them to approve site designs, what the construction would take, and when they can actually get into ground. This is increasingly, once a project has been sited, our communities have been finalized, increasingly becoming a differentiator. How can you show a reasonable amount of speed to market that is stable and sound and consistent, right? So do you have aligned zoning and permitting processes around your county within all of the communities, or do you have that ability to expedite something because the project is much more critical or has a higher economic impact, and so there's an ability to waive certain fees or waive certain time frames. Chicago did something similar with the specific sites and showing that the site is ready for development, along with kind of what the timeline would be to development. They also showcased a little bit of what has gone into the site to make it development ready, to show that there's been significant investment and significant time spent on creating a site that has been intentionally made ready. And then finally, that piece, that unique physical infrastructure. So in this case, it's almost those intangibles, but cultural community fit was a big component for Amazon as they think about it. And when you think about the recent challenges they've had in Seattle and kind of where that growth has had, the negative results of the growth that has had on that city, they begin to think about, we need to choose to be more proactive and intentional about the kind of growth that we want to give to the particular cities and making sure that there's an alignment with that. So in this particular case, Montgomery County out of Maryland showcases in a very visual way the kind of alignment that they see as they have with the type of community culture and fit that Amazon has set out for itself in this project. And so even if we think about a smaller project on that scale, every project will have some level of community fit or culture to it. So understanding that everyone in your community probably has a different definition of growth, but what is the standard definition of growth, especially among stakeholders and leaders in your community, and how can you all begin to row towards the same direction? The last thing you want to do as an economic developer is go after a project that doesn't align with the growth of what the city or the community actually really wants. This is another, I think, unique way of going about this, showcasing testimonials or showcasing that the existing industry base is on board with this. Any company or any project the size of Amazon coming into a community will have severe implications for the existing businesses. So showcasing that you have major employers and major brands that are on board provides a level of alignment and a level of readiness that, hey, we as an ecosystem, as an economic-based ecosystem, have developed a sense of what we want of growth, and our employers, existing employers, are on board with this, and we can make this work. So showcasing that. This is especially valuable, too, to collect these kinds of testimonials as you start to think about the kinds of projects that have recently expanded in your area or relocated. Having a sense of what their experiences will be essential for Amazon as they went through their community visits and being able to talk with some of those folks. And the community and quality of life factors. What I love about this particular best practice is that Philadelphia said, hey, we get it, we've had some work to do, but hey, look, we're doing the work, and this is the outcome of the work that we've been putting into this process. Critically, understanding what your data says about you is so important. There's a number of factors that will impact the outcome of what that data says, and so if there's an anomaly in your data, if there's an anomaly in something that has an explanation, be sure to capture that explanation in your RFI and make them aware of it, because we're only going to look at the numbers, and we're only going to look at what the black and white says, the black and white data say, and if it doesn't explain the right kind of message, make sure that you're conveying that in your overall RFI response. And then a more, what I would say, typical approach to showcasing the kind of quality of life components that you might find in it. But again, thinking back to those influencers of people, the accessibility of housing, of education, of childcare, those kinds of factors, all will begin to play a role in economic development. So even if your RFI doesn't require those kinds of elements to be included in it, including those elements will certainly be important as they begin to look at sort of the 100th decimal point of a score to say what really moves the needle in one direction or the other, all things being equal. And those community and quality of life factors will certainly help you do that. So just to kind of wrap this up and show what are some of those key takeaways around RFIs and best practices and how you can take this information and utilize it almost immediately and really begin to start leveraging this. The easiest way to get eliminated is not to submit on time or to submit an incomplete response. We received an RFI response one time from a community that was over 1,700 pages long. Because what they did is instead of aggregating the data in a usable way, they took all of the data they had and they dumped it into a file, thinking that more is better. And in reality, more can be better, but more used intentionally is better, right? Organize the data, aggregate in a way that we can leverage it. I can assure you that the site selectors aren't collecting this information just to use as wallpaper in their office, but instead they're really using it to make an informed decision. And if they can't access the data that you're providing them in an efficient and understandable way, it's not going to be easy for them. So keep it simple in the way that you convey the data, but be direct and succinct about how you answer that question. Using the format requested in the RFP is so critical to being able to do that. Timelines for site sectors are increasingly shrinking. Clients want to move faster. Speed to market starts in the boardroom when the first idea is made to relocate or expand or to grow the footprint. Speed to market begins then. And if that's the case, then everyone downstream in that opportunity has to move as quickly as they can to make sure that that project moves along as quickly and as successfully as it can to create a better outcome for the client. So when you get an RFI that says you have 72 hours to respond and we'd like it in a PDF instead of a Word document, or we'd like it in a Word document as opposed to a PDF and it's provided in a PDF, it's difficult to go back and get that letter. One of the communities, or one of the states rather, I believe it was Idaho, Boise, Idaho, that submitted a response for Amazon, submitted a 2-page letter in a Word document that said, save us in your cart for later. The idea that was, we know that we're not competitive in this field, but you may have another project, or there might be a smaller scale regional project that we could absorb. And they submitted it as a Word document, and they received a response back from Amazon to resubmit their RFI response as a PDF. So something as simple as that. Even though you're not maybe putting your best foot forward in that particular case, they still didn't listen to the exact format that they needed to. Organizing it in a way that's easy to navigate. I mean, this is so critical. Something as simple as including page numbers, including a table of contents will be critical to them being able to use that data in a way that actually is actionable. And I encourage you to again, in this process, to think about how you aggregated the data, and as you consolidate it, what is the best way to display it? What's the best way to use it? And a good way to do that is use someone who's relatively familiar with the data, provide them a copy of your RFI response, and see if it's easy for them to make heads or tails of that particular response. And then make sure that when you create the response itself, that you've asked all the questions you wanted to ask immediately. Right? Don't go back and ask piecemeal questions because the ball may have moved already and you may be behind the 8 ball. So making sure that you're on top of it, read through the RFI, create a list of questions, be intentional about how you reach out and communicate with that site selector, and ideally the next time you communicate with them is when you have the response for him or her. Some more best practices around just really product readiness, but really about readiness generally. Having a sense of that, what your pipeline is. A couple of them, notice that the best practices had a pipeline, sort of a phased approach that we know that this one isn't ready yet, but we know when it will be online, and we'll know when we'll be able to access that particular site itself. So even if you don't have sites right now, make sure that you have a plan in place to get those sites using options or purchase agreements that will provide some level of stability in pricing and certainty around that particular site and reduce that risk. But ensuring that if you have a sites and building database, make sure that that's up to date and that the information is accurate, and maintaining that is crucial. If you have mostly private landowners, making sure that you know sort of the fatal flaws of that site, what needs to be done, what are the utilities. So including those utility partners in there will be essential to making sure that it's accurate. Again, I talked about the data dump approach, right? So as you're providing the standard information that regardless of what site they go to, the labor force information will be the same, the incentives will likely be the same unless it's site specific or you're inside of some sort of enterprise zone for your state that has a specific taxing district that's different, highlight that. But outside of that, the overall incentive package and those components that will really be the same regardless of what site they're going to, provide that in a chunk. Organize that into one area because that data is not going to change regardless of where the site ends up. It might change from which jurisdiction it is, but it won't change necessarily what site that it goes to. And then on the other side of that, those information that information that is unique to that site, so capacity, water capacity, electric, et cetera, all of those things, who it's served by, what it's served by, the state of the readiness of that particular project, making sure that that information is specific to each site and that it's clued in and that it's apparent that it's not the same across the board. Because as we look at those particular sites, we don't want to assume that something is in place when it's really in fact not as we move forward. And finally, think about how you display the data that you have. In the particular case of sites, it's great to show maps because it gives us a sense of transportation assets, proximity to certain things, which will be really crucial. But make it a pleasing visual representation of what you want to put forward. Spending some time or energy around marketing and building out branding elements related to your sites or buildings, especially if you have an industrial park that you're looking to build out, is a really good way just to kind of build out those consistencies. At the same time, it also helps you create standardization around the data. If you begin to think about how you build out marketing collateral and the kind of information you want to showcase on those sites, it might help you expedite your RFI process if some of that collateral has already been developed. We talked about differentiation as being this, not necessarily a panacea, but certainly an approach to resolving the question of how do I differentiate myself around this increasing competitiveness and how do I stand out? The first thing you can do is simply write a cover letter, even if it doesn't ask for one. You can think about it as your first impression with that particular site selector, showcasing, being able to respond to those specific anomalies in data, identifying that value proposition that you bring to your particular, with your particular community or site, and what that means. And then think about those particular areas in your community that are non-obvious or even obvious, right? We may not be familiar with this particular area or this particular geography, so showcasing those things that you might know, take for granted as being top of mind every day, but for someone who's an outsider may not necessarily think about or know about. Keeping in mind that site selectors will likely have a very good idea of your community and the kind of assets and value proposition that it brings very early on in that process. Think about a value proposition or what your competitive positioning is, especially as it relates to the kind of industries that you want to attract. This can help you prioritize the kind of industries you should attract and the type of growth that you want. You might find that one industry has a more competitive positioning statement than another, and that can be an easy way for you to look at how you allocate your resources. And again, I talked about this a little bit before in the case of the testimonials. But getting testimonials, especially of those that are recent expansions or recent projects, whether they're expansions or relocations, is really important because we're going to want to talk to those individuals anyways, and you'll want to know what they're going to say about your process and what their experience was. And finally, once you receive an RFI, you have this unique opportunity because you know that this particular site selection agency or this particular site selector is in tune with that industry. And so as you move forward, building a site selection Rolodex, if you will, is really critical to your ability to penetrate that audience and showcase the points of differentiation. What I would caution there is keeping in mind that site selectors receive hundreds and hundreds of emails on a regular basis from economic development organizations all across the country. So how are you going to use the limited opportunity that you do have to influence their decision? How are you going to give them the data to do that? And as you look forward again to those future RFIs, some immediate things that you can start to begin to think about as you move forward in your own economic development organization. Again, keeping that sites and building database up to date, I can assure you that site selectors absolutely look at those and use those, and so having a sense of what that is will be really, really critical. And again, when you think about the nature of that, commercial or corporate real estate directors and commercial brokers, all of those folks that make site location decisions are your audience that you want to reach out to. Collecting that regional and local data and keeping it up to date and maintaining it will be really critical. And thinking about the partners that you'll need to be able to collect that data, your utilities, bringing them on board much earlier in the process. Right? So if you are an economic development organization, calling them the day the RFI is due and telling them that they have 2 hours to get this information probably isn't going to give them enough time. So being considerate of what it means for your partners to collect that information will be really critical. So a good way to go about doing that, again, is using RFI responses, especially ones that maybe you don't necessarily bid on because they're not competitive or not where you want to be. Use those opportunities to still go through that process to get that data aligned and condensed in a way that then can be leveraged later on. Defining growth in your community and making sure that you have a rounded sense of what that growth is and that everyone is on board with that sense of growth is really critical. And when you start to think about how you can be more intentional with your readiness, the kinds of strategies you build into that, being sure that you're building in a holistic approach to that does think about and consider place and does think about and consider talent as well. Because both of those components, again, as Amazon HQ has showed us, have certainly elevated in the economic development process. And as we saw early on in the presentation, the evolution of economic development certainly shows us that those two components have a higher role than maybe they did before. And again, leveraging those RFI opportunities to build that capacity is always a good best practice to look at as you move forward. And I think we have some time for questions. So if you haven't had a chance, certainly use the chat box to ask me questions about the RFI process, more specifically about your particular community or a challenge that you're thinking about or working on right now. One other component that wasn't included in the RFI best practices, but certainly showed itself this weekend, was what happens after the RFI is submitted and everything we're sort of in that waiting phase, holding pattern, if you will. We saw that out in Virginia, in the community just outside of DC there, that there were some leaks about the project maybe ending up there. And you saw the response that Mike Grella from Amazon had on that, but really a lesson learned of whether they're your internal stakeholders or other folks on your board, making sure that you have solid NDAs in place, non-disclosure agreements, a clear expectation with all of your stakeholders, what it means to have that project, pretty standard practice using project names for those things, all kind of roll up into this RFI best practice piece of it. Right, so we're getting some questions here. So first question is, which proposals were best, sort of top 5? I would say that those proposals that really stood out to me were ones that I think were graphically pleasing. One that kind of made it up here in New Hampshire didn't make it on the list, but I thought from a state level perspective, really well rounded out. They didn't meet some of the standard kind of check marks to make the mix, but I think Chicago did a really good job, especially with their field visit, just beyond their RFI. I think that New York and Toronto both did a pretty spectacular job. Boston did a good job with some of the graphical elements that they had included in their proposal. And so thinking about kind of just beyond the RFI response, but some of the other experiences that they had as well there. Another question, did you notice any big mistakes that you would have removed from many RFIs or from any of them? I think on this one, I would say yes. Certainly how they displayed the data and the way that it was organized. When I think about kind of some of the RFIs that came from the Midwest, It was a little bit chaotic in terms of how the data was displayed. So they showed alignment to different partners, but instead of integrating those alignment pieces seamlessly into the overall proposal, it was very distinct and different from each one. So they showed that they had alignment, but it felt very misaligned in terms of how the data was displayed in that particular case. Next question, was there a correlation between the quality of the proposals and the jurisdiction selected by Amazon for consideration? It's a good question. I think that there's probably a larger correlation with the level of, when you think about the project stipulations or considerations up front and how more aligned those are with the end result of those communities, there's probably a closer correlation with those. At the end of the day, I use New Hampshire as an example, really good solid proposal, but at the end of it, they don't necessarily reach the thresholds that Amazon was looking for in those particular cases. So as much as you can put forward your best value proposition or competitive positioning, the data show what the data show, and in some cases, it's cut and dry for site selectors. In other cases, you really can convince them to look more closely at your area and at least end up on that finalist list. Because at the end of the day, what you're looking for is that field visit from that site selector as opposed to a solid win right off the bat with your proposal. And as long as you can get that field visit and that finalist community, that, in my mind, is a successfully written RFI. I think we have one more minute or so for a few more questions, all really great questions. Last question here, does this change the site selection process for good, or was it simply Amazon's method? I think in this case, it's Amazon's method, but I would say that you're likely going to see some other companies try to copy this particular approach, especially those that have an economic development program already in place. I can think of a few sort of mid-sized companies that are 5,000 to 6,000 folks that have about 2 or 3 economic developers on staff. Facebook has a solid economic development team, especially around their data center practice. You'll likely see probably some of that play out with their approach. Google is very similarly oriented to Facebook. They have a team of data center folks really focused around that. So I think you'll see a smaller level of it play out similar to Amazon, but unless you're the size of Amazon and you can kind of get that level of interest, I think it'll be a little bit more challenging to create this process. I would also say that what happens at the end of this process, whether Amazon determines a set location or they break up their project in a couple of different regional locations, I think you'll see maybe a bit of a pushback from other EDOs in the future if a company tries this. Well, with that, I thank everyone on the call today. I certainly appreciate everyone's time and attention. We enjoyed this process immensely through these RFIs. This is something that we love. We got one more question, looks like. Nope, never mind. We enjoyed this process immensely. We're happy to, if you have questions individually, feel free to email me. I'm happy to take those questions. But really looking forward to seeing kind of what the end result of this Amazon HQ2 project is, and I think that we should, if we're on schedule, we should have a decision by the end of the year in terms of where it's going to go. Thank you to our hosts for this call, MidAmerica and EDA. They've been delightful to work with, and we certainly appreciate these opportunities to share our knowledge and share our experiences. Thank you.